What if Australia's most underrated car maker built some of its most unforgettable machines? Chrysler gave us strange luxury cars, tough Valiants, wild Pacers, and one Charger so legendary it still makes Ford and Holden fans nervous. Welcome to the 15 most iconic cars Chrysler Australia ever made. Here is a car nobody expected, and frankly, nobody knew what to do with. Launched in 1975, the Centura was Chrysler Australia's bold attempt at the medium car market, a European-sourced body underneath wearing local sheet metal and carrying the Chrysler badge with surprising confidence. The KC carried Chrysler's 4.0-litre Hemi 6, giving this imported European idea a very Australian engine, and that combination of continental packaging and local muscle created something genuinely unlike anything else in the local market at the time. It lasted barely 2 years before financial troubles killed it, but the Centura earns its place here for what it represented, a genuine attempt to evolve, diversify, and think beyond the usual formula. Chrysler dared to be different. The market just wasn't ready to agree. Before the Valiant nameplate became synonymous with Australian motoring, there was the Royal, and what a statement it made. The AP3, introduced in 1963, was an Australian-only Chrysler with strong American styling influence, bringing genuine transatlantic glamour to streets accustomed to far more modest machinery. Available with a 250 cubic inch 6 or optional 313 cubic inch V8, the Royal offered push-button automatic transmission, soaring tail fins, and interior appointments that made Australian-built rivals look distinctly provincial. This was a car for the seriously successful, the aspirationally bold, the buyer who wanted everyone to notice. Production numbers were always modest, but the AP3 Royal planted a flag. It told Australia that Chrysler was here to play at the premium end, and it built brand prestige that would underpin everything the company produced for the decade that followed. The R-Series of 1962 was where the Australian love affair with Chrysler's local product truly began. Assembled in Adelaide from imported, completely knocked-down kits, the R-Series arrived as a breath of fresh American air, bigger, bolder, and more powerful than anything the local competition offered. That 225 cubic inch slant 6 became one of the most celebrated engines in Australian automotive history, for very good reason. Tough, smooth, and almost impossible to kill, giving Chrysler a mechanical foundation that would serve them brilliantly for years to come. The R-Series wasn't just a car, it was the beginning of a dynasty. Chrysler had found their formula: take something fundamentally strong, adapt it intelligently for Australian conditions, and back it with genuine conviction. Every Valiant that carved its name into folklore started right here. And that was only the beginning, because once Chrysler proved the Valiant could work in Australia, they started building cars that felt less imported, more local, and far more dangerous to Holden and Ford. The next three show Chrysler Australia finding its identity before things get much wilder. The AP5 of 1963 refined the Valiant recipe with growing confidence, selling in serious numbers and embedding the nameplate firmly into Australian consciousness. Chrysler took the solid foundations of the R-Series and made everything better. Cleaner styling, more polished interior, a more convincingly Australian overall package. The trusty 225 continued doing sterling work, offering relaxed, effortless performance that Australian families adored. This was the generation that proved the Valiant formula worked, and that Australian buyers were ready to make it their own. The AP5 was the Valiant, finding its feet, discovering its audience, realizing that Australia wasn't just a market to sell into, it was a place that genuinely loved this car. With the AP5, Chrysler were serious contenders, and everybody knew it. If the AP5 planted the flag, the AP6 of 1965 drove it into the ground and refused to let anyone pull it out. This was the Valiant truly hitting its stride, more refined, more capable, and arriving precisely when Australian family motoring was evolving into something altogether more sophisticated. The AP6 introduced the first Australian-built Valiant V8, giving performance-minded buyers a genuinely compelling reason to choose a Chrysler over anything the competition could offer. It also gave the world the Valiant Wayfarer, a coupe utility that proved Chrysler understood the Australian market from the ground up. The AP6 proved Chrysler Australia wasn't just assembling cars for a market. They were crafting them, developing them, and thinking about exactly what Australian buyers needed. That attentiveness would build fierce loyalty, and the best was still very much yet to come. The VE of 1967 marked the point where the Valiant broke free from its American roots and became something unmistakably, defiantly Australian. This was the first Valiant developed with serious local engineering input, and the result felt more at home on Australian roads than anything that had come before. Styling was fresher, engineering more considered, and the options list better attuned to what Australian buyers actually wanted. Choices ran from the evergreen Slant 6 right up to V8 muscle for those who measured satisfaction in cubic inches. The VE established that Chrysler Australia had moved well beyond adapting American product for local sale. They were thinking locally, developing locally, building cars that resonated locally. It was a coming-of-age moment for the entire operation, and Australian motoring was all the richer for it. So far, Chrysler had built respect, but respect was not enough. The next three cars are where the company started building attitude, with hardtops, stripes, Pacers, and the first real signs that Chrysler Australia wanted more than just family car buyers. Now we're getting somewhere seriously interesting. The VF hardtop of 1969 was one of the most visually arresting things Chrysler Australia had put on four wheels, a long, pillarless two-door hardtop with dramatic coupe styling that demanded attention from every angle. Chrysler understood that Australian buyers weren't just shopping for transport. They were making statements, choosing sides in a conversation Ford and Holden had been dominating far too long. The VF hardtop was Chrysler's answer. That sweeping glasshouse, those clean flanks, the gorgeous absence of a B-pillar, it set the VF hardtop entirely apart. This wasn't a car you bought because it was sensible. You bought it because every time you walked towards it in a car park, you felt just a little better about your life choices. The VF Pacer deserves its own moment because it did something the standard Valiant couldn't quite manage. It made the brand feel genuinely exciting to younger buyers. Launched alongside the VF in 1969, the Pacer brought a sports-oriented flavor to the lineup, with distinctive striping, upgraded trim, and an attitude that said performance without quite screaming it. It arrived at exactly the right cultural moment when Australian buyers were increasingly interested in performance identity, cars that communicated something about who you were before you even turned the key. The Pacer proved Chrysler understood the market was shifting. Performance credibility wasn't just about horsepower numbers anymore. It was about image, presence, story. The VF Pacer told a very good story, and Chrysler was only just getting started. The VG Pacer took everything the VF had established and turned up the dial considerably. The Pacer identity was now genuinely distinct. A car with its own following, its own reputation, its own place in an increasingly competitive performance landscape where Ford and Holden were fighting tooth and nail for every sale. It brought meaningful engineering improvements and a presence that was impossible to ignore. The bonnet stripes, the badge work, the careful details that said, "This one is different." Chrysler knew exactly what they were building and who they were building it for. What made the VG Pacer significant was the groundwork it laid, because directly behind it in the Chrysler pipeline was something genuinely extraordinary, something that would change the performance conversation in this country forever. We'll get to that very shortly. The Pacers proved Chrysler could make a sedan feel exciting, but what came next changed everything. From here on, we enter the era of big luxury, bold styling, and the Charger, the car that turned Chrysler Australia from a competitor into a legend. The CH hardtop occupies one of the more fascinating positions in Australian automotive history, arriving in 1971 under the curious Chrysler by Chrysler branding as the company attempted to shift its flagship upmarket and away from the increasingly performance-focused Valiant name. Riding on the VH platform but positioned as something more premium, the CH hardtop offered luxurious appointments, a beautifully refined interior, and that spectacular pillarless roofline Chrysler Australia had already proven they could execute with absolute confidence. Perhaps too sophisticated for its moment, Australian buyers were fiercely attached to the Valiant name, and the premium identity never quite caught fire. But as an expression of what Chrysler achieved when they reached for genuine luxury, this extraordinary hardtop remains deeply compelling. By the time the VH Pacer arrived in 1971, the Pacer nameplate carried genuine weight. This wasn't just a trim level, it was a legitimate performance identity with a passionate following, and the VH delivered with the conviction that only comes from a manufacturer that has truly found its voice. The VH Pacer rode on the same platform underpinning the legendary Charger, which meant chassis dynamics were genuinely impressive for the era. This was a car that handled, that breathed, that rewarded the driver who chose to push rather than simply point. With bold graphics, muscular stance, and real mechanical credibility, the VH Pacer was the absolute pinnacle of the Pacer concept. Everything that nameplate had been building across the VF and VG generations arrived fully formed right here. The right car at precisely the right time. Here is where the Charger story gets genuinely breathtaking. The E55 was the V8 flagship of Chrysler's coupe masterpiece, all the drama of the Charger, wrapped in the finest appointments the company could muster, powered by a 340 cubic inch 5.6-liter V8 that made certain nobody would mistake this for the base model. The 770 specification meant full luxury trim, comprehensive instrumentation, and interior quality that surprised buyers, assuming performance cars had to choose between going fast and traveling in comfort. With the E55 V8 up front, that choice simply was not on the table. Drive it to a black-tie dinner, flog it through the hills on the way home. Chrysler built something that transcended the usual categories, and the E55 deserves every syllable of praise history has bestowed upon it. And now we are down to the three cars that define Chrysler Australia more than anything else. One made the Charger dream accessible, one was built for battle, and one became the ultimate Aussie Mopar legend. These are the cars people still argue about today. The Charger XL made the most iconic coupe Australia ever produced accessible, probably putting more Chargers on local roads than any other specification. Launched in 1971, the XL wore the same stunning body as every Charger because there was only one Charger body, and it was perfect. Powered by the 245 cubic inch Hemi 6, the XL delivered everything the Charger offered. That extraordinary fastback roofline, the aggressive front end, the visual theater of a car that looked like it was doing 150 standing still, without the premium price. A Charger was a Charger, regardless of the badge on the boot lid. The XL made sure buyers who dreamed of owning one did not have to keep dreaming. Sometimes the most important car is not the fastest. Sometimes it is simply the one that opens the door. The E38, a letter and two numbers that still make Australian performance enthusiasts go very quiet before they start talking very fast. This Charger arrived in 1971, packing a 265 cubic inch Hemi 6 breathing through triple Weber carburetors, producing around 280 horsepower, immediately establishing itself as one of the most formidable performance cars this country had ever seen. This was not a car for the timid. It demanded respect, rewarded commitment, and punished complacency, the hallmarks of a genuine performance machine, not a merely fast one. Real mechanical soul, built by people who cared deeply. The E38, proved Chrysler Australia, belonged at the top of the performance conversation, not as an also-ran, not as a challenger, but as a genuine, uncompromising peer. And yet something even more extraordinary was waiting at number 1. The car at the absolute summit of everything Chrysler Australia achieved. One of the greatest performance cars this country has ever produced. Full stop. The E49 took the already ferocious E38 and asked the question only obsessed engineers dare ask: what if we made it more savage still? The answer was a 265 cubic inch Hemi 6 modified so aggressively it produced around 302 horsepower, enough to push the Charger past 230 kilometers per hour. Homologated for competition, the E49 was built to race, and it did so with spectacular results. Production was never going to be large. This was a homologation special, not a volume seller, and very few genuine E49s survive today. That scarcity means prices that make even serious collectors take a long breath before reaching for the checkbook. But the money is beside the point. Wild, committed, uncompromising, and utterly magnificent. The E49 is Chrysler Australia's ultimate statement, and nothing that ever wore that badge came close. Chrysler Australia may never have matched Holden or Ford for sheer size, but when they got it right, they built cars people still remember decades later. So did your family ever own a Valiant, a Pacer, a Royal, or maybe even a Charger? Let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe if you want. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.